Hey everyone, this is Ben Norton, and you are watching or listening to the Multipolarista podcast. And today I have a friend of the show, Robbie Martin. He's a great journalist who's covered, neoconservatives documenting the U.S. rights and pro-war forces in Washington for many years. He's got a really good documentary focused on it called A Very Heavy Agenda. He's also a co-host of Media Roots Radio with Abby Martin, his sister. They're both great journalists. And I brought in Robbie today because he's done a lot of research on this so-called populist right. And this is something that we've seen emerge in the U.S. really since the election of Trump. This very cynical, ridiculous campaign to try to portray Republicans as so-called populists. And that term really means nothing. I mean, we can get into that a bit later. The term populist is used so contradictorily to mean different things. But what I want to focus on today is the very ridiculous attempt and cynical attempt to try to portray some of these Republicans as anti-war, when in reality, some of these Republicans, all they do is oppose war on Russia, but they support war on China. They support war on Iran. They support war on Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua. They're not anti-war, but there's been this very misleading campaign led by people like Tucker Carlson, and Glenn Greenwald has been playing into this, and we can talk about that in a second, trying to portray Republicans as so-called anti-interventionists and Democrats as the party of war. Both parties are completely pro-imperialist. Both parties are completely pro-war. Now, there's a division within the U.S. ruling class, and some elements of the ruling class want war on Russia. They tend to be largely Democrats. And some elements of the U.S. ruling class want war on China, and they tend to be Republicans, and especially these fake so-called populists. But they're all pro-war. And this idea that the Republican Party is realigning and becoming a working class party and it's anti-war is ridiculous nonsense. And what's so crazy to me, Robbie, I just want to begin kind of reflecting on this. What's so crazy is, I've been involved in the anti-war movement since like 2006, 2007. I was a little too young to be like right when the Iraq War happened. I was a little too young. But I remember from the very earliest days of my involvement in the anti-war movement, everyone understood that both bourgeois parties in the U.S. are enemies of progressive working people. They're both imperialist parties. They both support war. And the idea of voting for a Democrat was seen as a lesser evil strategy and was opposed by most people in the anti-war and anti-imperialist movement. But what's incredible is I've seen some people, I mentioned Glenn Greenwald and others, who've basically done kind of a reverse lesser evilism, and they're now trying to convince people who oppose war and empire that the Republicans are a lesser evil. So they've adopted the same lesser evilism rhetoric, but for another faction of the U.S. ruling class. And as you've documented, I mean, all these figures, Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, Josh Hallway, they're all complete neocons. Now, they don't support war on Russia, but they support war on China and Iran and Venezuela and Cuba. Trump murdered the second in command of the Iranian government, Qasem Soleimani. Trump expanded the war in Afghanistan and the war in Yemen. He militarily occupied Syria. He imposed brutal sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba. He tore up arms agreements with Russia. And yet, we're supposed to believe that Trump and all of these Republicans are anti-war populists. I mean, let's just reflect on this what I see as a very cynical marketing campaign. What do you think, Robbie?
I mean, there's so much to say just about how you just introed this segment. But I guess I'll start with something I've been thinking about recently, which is this technique, which I think has become very popular since Trump. I don't think Trump started it. In fact, I think Bannon actually has a lot to do with this, which is using rhetoric from the left, typically even some rhetoric from like left academia that's like structural critique, and using the energy from that for right-wing purposes. And I think one of the most famous versions of that is the deep state, how it's become sort of a right-wing talking point, but it originally comes from sort of left-wing structural critique of the U.S. empire, the military-industrial complex, and things like that. And I think this kind of goes back to, you can see hints of this in, Steve Bannon, before he became a household name, was a documentary filmmaker. And one of his biggest influences was Michael Moore. And I think he's very open about that Michael Moore is someone that he sort of admired, his ability to, sort of push these left-wing narratives in sort of a provocative agitprop form. And it's not just the style in which Michael Moore pushed it. I also think the rhetoric itself has been used by people on the right to gain credibility that, let's say it's credibility that it's worked on the left. Like people who are genuinely consistently anti-war on the left are typically more admired or more revered as being like more consistent and real people. And I think some of that credibility has been seen by people on the right as some kind of badge of honor that can be used to sort of portray someone on the right as being different or being even anti-establishment. And we saw this work very well during the 2016 election, where Trump basically obliterated the Bush legacy by using the Iraq war against them. Not just Jeb, but his brother by proxy. Even though Trump was sort of waffling on his own support for the Iraq war at times while it was happening. So what you have is sort of this revisionist history going on, this revisionist technique where these politicians know now, a lot of them on the right, understand that being against war in a general sense, in a largely sort of symbolic sense, without really going underneath the surface of what that really means, gains you credibility as a politician who's fighting against the establishment of some kind. And I think there's an important distinction to be made too. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with this, but I just saw someone on Twitter say that, Republicans are not actually anti-war. They're technically anti-intervention in a narrow sense in certain circumstances. But I think what that poster was saying that I kind of agree with, and maybe that's not exactly what he meant, but being anti-war to me means being morally opposed to the idea of killing civilians in other countries, being morally opposed to war. And ever since Republicans in general started adopting any anti-war rhetoric after the Bush era, which I'd say really started with the Tea Party on Afghanistan, the Republican, or sort of the libertarian Republican framing on being anti the Afghanistan war has always come down to, this is a waste of our American soldiers' lives and our resources. It's never about, the Afghan people are suffering unnecessarily from us occupying their country. Civilians are being killed all the time. There's nothing about that in the Republican framing about this. So even you take it back to the very beginning of this sort of anti-interventionism framing that people like Rand Paul were pushing around the same time of the Tea Party, I would say it was never actually anti-war. It's just anti-specific kinds of intervention based on largely selfish reasons, America first, reasoning, this sort of nationalistic reasoning. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but I'll just stop there because I know we have more to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, that's a key point. And here, I mean, I don't want to get too much into the weeds about this at the beginning, because I want to focus more on just exposing the ridiculous pro-war propaganda of people like Tucker Carlson and Ron DeSantis and Josh Hawley and other so-called, and Tulsi Gabbard, who's become a full-on conservative, speaking at the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC. I mean, but anyway, before we get to that, I do think that it's important to distinguish being anti-intervention, being anti-war, and being anti-imperialist, because there's this lazy attempt to conflate all those things together. There are people who are anti-intervention but pro-imperialist. In fact, they're called libertarians, many of them. I mean, I don't want to get into a whole discussion about libertarianism, but a lot of these, like you said, a lot of these right-wing voices, Rand Paul is an example, who calls himself kind of a libertarian, even though unlike his dad, he's actually part of the Republican Party. But these kind of right-wing libertarian voices, they're against interventionism, but not because of some ideological opposition. It's because they see it as being against U.S. interests, and they, in some cases, being against even imperial interests. So, I mean, the idea of being anti-imperialist is being against imperialism as an economic system, which is rooted in capitalism. So the idea of a Republican being anti-imperialist is just it's preposterous. It's completely absurd. And seeing people say that there are anti-imperialist Republicans, they don't know what anti-imperialist means. I mean, and then you also raise a good point about being anti-war. Like, being anti-war is also being ideologically rooted in commitment to opposition to war because of its destruction of civilian lives, because of the damage it does to working people and humble people and average people. But you have to understand what imperialism is as an economic system to be opposed to it. And like I said, I mean, if you listen to a lot of this rhetoric, they say, well, I'm against war on Russia because it's bad for America. And actually, what we want is war on China because that's better for the US empire. And what this comes down to, I think, is what I said at the beginning. There's this fundamental conflict. There's a disagreement within the US ruling class. And there are some people who think, no, we need to ally with Russia to wage war on China. And if you listen to this so-called populist right, that's what they're all saying. They're all saying, our real enemy is not Moscow, it's Beijing. It's the Communist Party of China. They're all full on with the new Cold War on China, not to mention Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Iran, as we'll get to. So for me, I mean, the opposition to China is a key part of this, and I'm curious if you agree with that.
It's a fundamental part of this. And I mean, I was just speaking with someone named Dave Ducamp who writes for Anti-War. He's more of a libertarian, and the only name he could come up with was Thomas Massey, and the only name I could come up with was Rand Paul, of people who hold office on the right, who are, you know, so-called anti-war, anti-interventionists, who do not also feed into a hysterical, hawkish framing on China. And so I think that that's very notable, is that if you really look at the entire spectrum of all these people who are supposedly, you know, right populists, anti-war people, there's really only a tiny amount of them, a tiny percentage of them who actually do not engage in the hawkish rhetoric on China. Now, I really think there's a lot of resemblances between sort of the more liberal, you know, Robert Kagan, Bill Kristol, neocon way of looking at Ukraine and Russia, like a lot of these people see China and Taiwan. In fact, right after Biden, you know, started escalating things in Ukraine, and after Russia invaded Ukraine recently, you did start to see a lot of those supposedly populist anti-war Republicans, like I want to say Howley. I think I saw Howley doing it, and some other people immediately pivoting to saying, like, Biden's lost Ukraine, now he's going to lose Taiwan too. It's like, wait a second, I thought you guys were not worrying about Ukraine before. They can very quickly pivot to that, you know, when it comes to what how they really feel, because on some level it's arbitrary, you know, why they would think that Taiwan needs defending from American intervention, but Ukraine doesn't, you know, so it's inconsistent in terms of like their worldview. So I think that, I mean, yeah, the China thing is fundamental in all of this, because what we've seen, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, is a resurrection of sort of these very hawkish, I would argue, very neoconservative, classic neoconservative views coming out all over right-wing media, especially against China. I mean, we even saw a whole media apparatus sort of form around this mentality. You know, the Epoch Times started being dropped off on people's doorsteps in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the newspaper, is half of it is just like neoconservative, you know, foaming at the mouth rhetoric about China in all kinds of different ways. So,
And
I mean,
Robbie,
I could talk more about that, but yeah.
The Epoch Times, you should explain, is a propaganda arm of this far-right Chinese cult called Falun Gong, which is obviously linked to U.S. intelligence, and the U.S. and Canadian governments have been funding their media arm, their TV arm, and they basically just went full in support of Trump. And Falun Gong also basically preached that Trump was sent by God to come and destroy China. And their media arm, Epoch Times, just became basically an appendage of the Republican Party.
Yeah. So, I mean, and it goes a lot further than that too. I mean, I would say just overall, there's a sort of a weird faction of sort of these hawkish, you know, war-making people in the ruling class who have worked with various cults over the years, including, you know, a cult you're probably familiar with, MEK, to sort of drum up anti-Iran, you know, regime change sentiment. Falun Gong is sort of one of the cults that we work with to drum up anti-Chinese sentiment. We also work with the Moonies, or it's that in terms of U.S. intelligence to Moonies pipeline, it's not clear, but like the Washington Times, for example, which is sort of a weird outlet that kind of straddles the line between like right-wing alt media and like regular media. That's also linked to another cult called the Moonies. But yeah, I mean, this is all wrapped up in some weird group of people that really have this agenda where they really came knives out during the COVID-19 pandemic, and linked up with, like, we saw an actual confluence of classic Project for the New American Century neocons like Frank Gaffney, people like Gordon Chang, James Woolsey, linking up with people like Steve Bannon, and sort of creating a little sector of think tanks in DC that sort of mixed together the right populist framing that became popular during Trump and sort of this very specific agenda to do some kind of regime change or turn up the heat against China. And I think the one that probably embodies that the most strongly is the Foundation for Defense for Democracies, which is an Israeli government, partly Israeli government funded neocon think tank that's specifically always been about regime change in Iran, that sort of pivoted to China during the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And I do think that there is a lineage of these specific, more hawkish neocons, like the Gaffneyites, the Frank Gaffney clique, that split off from the Bill Kristols and the Robert Kagans sometime around 2006, 2007, when it came to at least the way they rhetorically wanted to talk about Iran. And people like Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan didn't talk anymore about openly wanting to bomb Iran or preemptively nuke them. But these other neocons would still push very strong hawkish rhetoric against Iran, regime change, and that was their focus. And I would say that that's sort of the lineage of where these sort of anti-China neocons largely come from. But we're mostly talking about the populist right, and they've sort of bled into that world, and that and that's it's a thing now where they're kind of, it's hard not to find this neocon rhetoric within the populist right world. Even some of the most supposedly, anti-establishment populist right outlets you can find, even some of the more conspiracy media people, that it's all bled into everywhere pretty much. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, InfoWars for years has been pushing this Chi-Com propaganda, talking about Chi-Coms, Chinese communists have infiltrated every institution, the Chinese communists. And basically, they don't use the term Chi-Com, but I mean, those so-called populist right, that's all they do. We'll talk about Tucker Carlson. All he does is accuse everyone of being soft on the Communist Party of China, accusing, he has on all these neocons who accuse the Democratic Party of being communist Chinese assets or whatever. I mean, it's really insane. And on this subject, I mean, just today, I'm going to get up this tweet. Just today is May 13th. This guy, Jim Banks, who's a congressman in Indiana, who's one of these fake, he calls himself, pro-working class. He calls himself a populist. Here's his Twitter account, Afghanistan veteran, and his pinned tweet says, working class GOP. He's going to make the GOP a working class party. I mean, it's the most ridiculous bullshit. And just today, he boasted that he introduced the Communist Visa Transparency Act. This is literal McCartheyite bullshit. I mean, this is straight up Joseph McCarthy era legislation, where he says he's boasting, his office boasted in this press release, he introduced the Communist Visa Transparency Act legislation to require all visa applicants to the United States to report any affiliation with a communist party, and to require applicants from China to report any affiliation with China's military, paramilitary, law enforcement, public security, or national security services. I mean, this is a quote from him. This is a so-called populist who claims that he wants the GOP to be a working class party. Not a single Biden administration or federal government official can accurately estimate how many Chinese Communist Party members currently live in the United States. That is an unacceptable national security risk. Talking about malign influence. I mean, this is straight up McCarthyism. And this isn't even to mention, I mean, like I said, there is a split. There are some Republicans who want to ally with Russia against China, so they oppose the proxy war in Ukraine. But Josh Hawley, I mean, people jokingly call him Josh Hallway, like he also is portrayed as one of these fake pro-worker Republicans. He's called a populist up there with like J.D. Vance. And look at these tweets. He's been criticizing Biden from the right on Ukraine, saying that Biden is not being aggressive enough against Russia. He said, I just finished a briefing with President Zelensky of Ukraine, whose courage on behalf of his people is inspiring. Zelensky urgently asked the U.S. to stop imports of Russian gas and oil. When will Joe Biden listen? So this is so-called right-wing populism. Here's another one. I mean, this is, again, one of these so-called anti-war Republicans who also, by the way, when he was in college, supported the Iraq war. Like all of these so-called populist right people, they were just neocons who are trying to rebrand. They all supported the Iraq war, including Trump, including Tucker Carlson. Here's Josh Hallway again. Powerful message this morning from President Zelensky of Ukraine. Said he wished Joe Biden would step up and lead the world. Biden needs to get serious and shut down energy production and arm the Ukrainians with MiGs, which are fighter jets, to defend the skies. He's calling for a hot war with Russia. He's calling for World War III. This guy is a populist? What the hell is this?
You know, the name escapes me now. Maybe you remember who he is. He was recently on Tucker Carlson, Howley-esque, coming out again as someone who was actually saying like he was against neocons. Another Peter Thiel sort of propped up candidate. And he even went further than that. He said something like, we need to send in like some like real mad dog, like fighter pilot, like US fighter jets, like into Ukraine to like bait like basically like a Russian plane or soldier into shooting one of them so that we can just like, you know, obliterate a bunch of Russian soldiers. Like he wanted to go like Top Gun style, like on the Russian army in Ukraine. So I mean, so I think that the timing of that tweet's really interesting. You pulled up because the script keeps being revised. It's like they get their messaging at a certain point. Like, I don't know how Howley is talking now, but I'd imagine he's sort of more joined along with this consensus that this is, you know, this administration is taking us down a dangerous road in Ukraine. But you're right. A lot of these populist right acting Republicans were trying to out-hawk a Biden right after Russia invaded Ukraine. And that was their position at first. Now, I'm sure a lot of them has sort of, you know, changed their position since then, but I think it's just very indicative of like, that's really about. It's not, I mean, it's only, like I was saying, they only use sort of this, you know, so-called anti-war rhetoric when it's convenient for them. And I think, you know, someone like Tulsi Gabbard, for example, I don't know how, you know, if she is I don't know how right-wing she actually is. I think she is pretty right-wing in some areas, but she, you know, largely rebranded from being a hawk to some kind of anti-neocon, anti-war person. And she, you know, specifically with Ukraine, she was one of the first Democrats to come out and talk very strongly against sending more money and weapons to Ukraine a couple of years ago. And what's strange to me, and she's never explained why she originally voted for the $300 million weapons supplemental to Ukraine. So there's a lot of politicians who have tried to do this. And I think that basically what it illustrates is that it's very easy to use anti-war rhetoric, almost like virtue signaling. I don't know a better phrase to use than that, when there's really no substance behind it. And what it, you know, backing that up with something or a record or a track record, especially when it comes to all these new people who come onto the scene like Howley, who, you know, I don't even really know. Is there even anything he said in public about the Iraq war? Because that's awfully convenient too. If you could just sort of, you know, have this clean slate, jump into the fray, and not really, you know, have anything for people to check to see if you have supported the Iraq war or not. You know, like even someone like Greenwald has been writing long enough to actually have things where it did seem like he sort of passively supported the Iraq war, because that's how long he's been writing. So you can go find writings of his like that now.
Yeah, and there's a lot to say about that, and we can talk about Glenn and all of that later, and because I think it's worth calling. I mean, Glenn has basically just become a Republican he's constantly in Fox News defending these so-called right-wing populists. But before we do that, I think we should start really with the kind of king of these fake right populists, and that's Tucker Carlson. So there is this really good article by friend of the show, Alan McLeod, over at Mint Press. And I know that you helped send some research to him for this article on Tucker Carlson. It's titled "The Elite Pedigree of a Brilliant Cosplaying Populist." And I'll let you kind of summarize some of the main points. But in this article, he points out how, Tucker comes from this extremely rich family. He used to boast about how he was a completely out of touch elite. And now all he does is criticize the elites, but he never defines what an elite actually is. He's certainly not against capitalists because he's very pro-capitalist. So he uses elite in this very ambiguous way that makes it easy to be a so-called populist because, again, all this is left undefined and politically vague. Meanwhile, I mean, you found, and Alan McLeod showed in this article, that Tucker Carlson tried to join the CIA. And I mean, his dad also is very shady, which you can talk about, working for CIA media outlets, U.S. regime media outlets, spreading propaganda. So Tucker Carlson is CIA adjacent. And Tucker Carlson was in Nicaragua, where I am right now, in the 1980s, supporting the Contra death squads, and was apparently working with the CIA-backed right wing in Nicaragua because there are photos of him with Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, who became the U.S.-backed right-wing puppet leader after the Sandinistas were pushed out of power by the U.S. through this terrorist war. So, I mean, not even to mention, which we'll talk about in a bit, we'll show some clips of Tucker's insane pro-war propaganda against China and Iran and Venezuela. But even aside from that, I mean, Tucker Carlson has an extremely shady history. So talk about his links to the CIA, his father's extremely shady work, and what he was doing in Nicaragua in the 80s.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I recently found this interview he gave where he's just sort of being asked random questions. I think it's just like sort of like a lightning round of questions some talk show host was asking him. And one of the questions was like, what did he do when he was in college, or what's something like exciting or strange he did in college? And he says that he ended up going down to Nicaragua to help the Contras in their war. He doesn't specifically mention the CIA in this little interchange, but people like you and me and other people who've studied U.S. imperialism understand that was a major CIA war in Nicaragua, where the CIA and lots of disinformation and lots of forces were used to try to discredit the Sandinistas, propagandize against them. And what's fascinating is it's almost like, so he tried to join the CIA and apparently didn't get in, according to him. Meanwhile, his father starts work at the U.S. Information Agency under Reagan. He was handpicked actually by Reagan. He made friends with someone who was close to Ronald Reagan. Dick Carlson did, Tucker Carlson's father. And he got hired to be the head of the Voice of America, which is the radio arm of sort of U.S. disinformation. It's a U.S. state-funded media outlet that's closely been linked to the CIA since its existence. He's also partly responsible, even though he claims he's not. The timing of when he got there is simultaneously when Radio Marti started, which was another U.S. state-funded media outlet that was broadcast only in Cuba, designed to, sort of undermine the Cuban government, essentially, which is the purpose of all U.S. state-funded media, essentially. And he was also instrumental in collaborating with a radio station called Radio Beijing. Now, this apparently was not officially part of VOA, but they somehow collaborated with them during the Tiananmen Square incident as well. So oddly, Dick Carlson, Tucker Carlson's son, played this really big role in opening up
dad.
Cuba.
Tucker Carlson's
sorry
dad.
to say his son. Sorry. Played this really big role in opening up Cuba and China to a lot of U.S. propaganda via their airwaves in their own native languages. So like in Cuba in Spanish, and I don't know what it was, what if they did it in Mandarin in China, but it basically was designed to undermine both of those governments. And Dick Carlson has this extremely interesting, detailed interview he did with a student at some college where he goes through every experience he had at VOA and what he did. One question that the guy asked him is, he says, would you, from a practical point of view, if you are from the other side, is a Voice of America correspondent far more dangerous than a spy? And Dick Carlson says, oh, yes, it is far more dangerous. So he's sort of bragging throughout this interview of like how much of a role they had to play and like sort of this spycraft like activity of undermining these other governments, throughout the world. And he was also instrumental in, some of the broadcasts in Soviet territory and in the Soviet Union as the Berlin Wall is falling. So his role there, he was part of all these really big events that were considered, these big wins for the U.S. government. And meanwhile, around the same time, his son is doing what appears to be almost like a Mormon-style mission, like a CIA Mormon-style mission to Nicaragua to help the Contras fight in this war that was also being, propped up by Reagan's CIA. So very, very strange history there. And also Tucker describes him going down with some of his college buddies. One of those buddies is someone who people may be familiar with, Neil Patel, who ended up being a top advisor to Dick Cheney and a very instrumental player in the Bush administration. And this is also something interesting. You have this idea that Tucker Carlson is some kind of populist. Well, the Swanson dinner, his father marrying the heir of the Swanson, Swanson dinner fortune, kind of takes that label away from him to some extent. But I think this idea that he made his way through media by like climbing up, writing for papers or whatever, however he wants to present himself is also false, because his father nepotistically got him his first media job because his father was also involved in running PBS. And Tucker's first media job was not like being like a mailroom clerk at PBS. It was literally like being given his own show at PBS. So his daddy got him his own show under his own name, like as his first media gig, incidentally enough. So that was before Tucker Carlson started working for Bill Kristol at the Weekly Standard, which we can talk about later if you want.
Yeah, I mean, this is a key point. We need to understand that, Tucker has been trying to rebrand as like the right-wing populist who's against the neocons. He was a neocon for the vast majority of his career. He got his start at the Weekly Standard, but I'll get to that in a second. I mean, just for people who are skeptical, this is an article back in 2017 before Tucker became like a massively huge name with the biggest show in the U.S. over at The Week, and it's citing this report in the New Yorker. And it's Tucker Carlson tried to join the CIA. And here's the quote from this profile in the New Yorker magazine. After college, Carlson tried and failed to persuade the CIA to employ him. I mean, again, that's what he says. How much can you believe someone who admitted to trying to join the CIA? But let's talk about what Tucker did after, supporting the Contras in Nicaragua and trying to join the CIA. He also started working for neocon media outlets, including the Neocon Bible, the Weekly Standard, and he was actually a Democrat until 2020. He was registered as a Democrat, and it shows again how these neocons, they have this, they go constantly in between the two parties, right? Because when it comes to imperialism, Democrats and Republicans are indistinguishable. They both support U.S. empire and war. So it's not surprising to see that Tucker was a Democrat and then now he's a Republican, because, he was a neocon. Talk about what he was doing for years leading up to now.
I mean, one of the most interesting things I found about him, and this is completely randomly, because I buy, if I find a good collection of old Weekly Standards issues, I'll buy them on like eBay, because a lot of those reprintings or the digital copies don't exist. So some of that stuff is kind of like lost in time forever. So I just brought a stack randomly from the 90s on eBay. It was like $20 for like 20 issues or something. And I was like kind of surprised, because I just had no idea that like half of the issues had Tucker Carlson's name the credits, and I was like, oh, this is really crazy. I just had no idea, the way he presents himself now, that he even wrote for the Weekly Standard. And I was already familiar with his book Ship of Fools, which depicts Bill Kristol in cartoon caricature form on the cover. Like, look at this, fucking idiot. He's, a total warmonger. It's kind of like the way Tucker is presenting him in this book. Although Tucker admittedly does say in the book that he still thinks Bill Kristol is like charming and funny, and he contrasts him with Robert Kagan, saying Robert Kagan was like an arrogant a-hole and someone that he did not like at all. But when Tucker Carlson wrote for the Weekly Standard, most of his stuff was pretty boilerplate. It's funny you mentioned that he was a Democrat, because it's largely just like social conservative boilerplate kind of crap in the Weekly Standard. A lot of people forget that the neocon Bible, as they call it, the Weekly Standard, had a lot of stuff in it also that resembles the kind of right populist, America First stuff people, say is populist today. It was mixed together.
And Robbie, that whole America First branding, that goes back to Ronald Reagan.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. So Tucker Carlson, I'd say probably the most interesting editorial or article that I just happened to come across in the stack of Weekly Standards I had was an article, a very long article, bashing journalist, San Jose Mercury writer, journalist Gary Webb for his expose on the CIA having a role in the crack epidemic and being involved in drug trafficking. And
in order to fund the Contra death squads that Tucker Carlson supported.
Exactly. And it gets even weirder too, right? Because I was like, well, wait a second. I remember seeing Elliot Abrams' name on one of these Weekly Standards in this same archive I bought. So I was looking through a bunch of them, and I started to find, in consecutive months, bylines from Tucker and Elliot Abrams on like the same Weekly Standard issues. And I'm like, so this is the guy who literally was taking money from Oliver North's slush fund, who was implicated in the Iran-Contra scandal in the Reagan administration. Elliot Abrams, for people who don't know, also a project for the New American Century, neocon, wrote articles side by side with Tucker Carlson in the Weekly Standard. Meanwhile, Tucker Carlson is writing articles saying, oh, there's nothing to see here. This is all scaremongering from this crazy, crackpot journalist, Gary Webb. So it's multiple layers of ridiculousness when you think about it. It's, there's one of the guys who was part of Iran-Contra writing for the same magazine Tucker is, while he's, bashing Webb. And it's fascinating because there's this whole idea now that sort of these right populists are somehow aligned in opposition to the CIA. Like the deep state is liberal, right? According to these people. So therefore, they're in opposition to the CIA. Now it's interesting to me because this theme actually does go back to even like very, very neocon administrations. You can make the argument, if you wanted to, that the Bush administration was against the CIA for trying to wage some kind of like, war against a part of the CIA by uncovering Valerie Plame's name and her husband, going against Joe Wilson, them basically trying to browbeat aspects of the CIA into giving them the intelligence that they wanted to, and then punishing them when they didn't. I mean, so this whole idea, I think, has just become so oversimplified, and deliberately so, to make it appear that these people are somehow like in opposition to the deep state of the CIA, when it's just clear that at the very least, it's not that simple. And we have ample evidence that Tucker is like right in the pocket of this alignment that was completely aligned with some of the most hardcore hawkish CIA forces that there ever were, like in our lifetime. So it's kind of peculiar that now he's acting like he is, completely on the opposite of this, today.
Yeah, I mean, and this narrative goes back to Nixon, who, I mean, in some ways was kind of a victim of the deep state. There was, Watergate is a whole other thing to get into, and the role of the CIA and that, and the CIA's chosen journalist that it works with at the Washington Post and all that. But I mean, you could go back to Richard Nixon, who was, of course, a hardcore right-wing conservative, vehement anti-communist, who also, would criticize the CIA after, organizing the coup in Chile, and Richard Nixon's national security advisor Henry Kissinger saying "make the economy scream" in Chile and all that. But anyway, I want to get to what Tucker still does today, because look, one of the talking points used by people is they say, fine, Tucker has a history for the vast majority of his career of being a neocon, supporting the Iraq war. He referred to Iraqis as semi-literate primitive monkeys. I mean, so we haven't even talked about Tucker Carlson being a full-on white supremacist. I mean, he's a straight-up explicit racist. And of course, I mean, how anyone can look past that and justify that, for me, is just fucking mind-blowing. I mean, this guy is a complete white supremacist. But even aside from that, I mean, I want to focus on what he's still doing today, because his critics, or his supporters rather, will say, well, you know, Tucker Carlson was bad, 10 years ago, but he's turned a new leaf. He's no longer a neocon. Now he's supposedly anti-war. I want to show some of these clips of the insane propaganda on his show, and you have like a really good thread with some of these video clips showing how he's been pushing a bunch of full-on neocon propaganda against Venezuela, Iran, and especially China. But I'm going to start with this clip here, which is from 2018, and this is an insane neocon clip about Venezuela that you found. And again, this is Tucker Carlson in 2018. This is not back when he supported the Iraq War and wasn't full-on neocon. And now this is when he claims to be a right-wing populist. Here's this clip you have.
We have war criminals in our own hemisphere. China is taking over Latin America and the Caribbean. Venezuela has...
Oh my God. I mean, there's so many things to say about this clip, but just he starts saying, we have war criminals in our own hemisphere. Of course, he's not referring to the U.S. government officials who are war criminals. He's referring to Latin America. And then he says China is taking over our hemisphere, referring to Latin America as the U.S. colonial property. So, I mean, that rhetoric alone is just, it shows like this idea of a right-wing populist. It's such bullshit. But let me continue here.
We have war criminals in our own hemisphere. China is taking over Latin America and the Caribbean. Venezuela has collapsed. El Salvador is collapsing. Mexico has a drug war that's killed more people than we lost in Vietnam. The world in our hemisphere, our neighbors, contiguous countries are collapsing, and we're ignoring that for the sake of some weird war in Syria 6,000 miles from here. Does this seem a little off to you?
Well, as I said to you before, because we can't deal with every incidence of war criminalization.
So the guy speaking is a former Hillary Clinton advisor. And what Tucker always does is he always has this false debate with some, neoliberal pro-war Democrat. He won't debate it with, a leftist who supports Venezuela or China or whatever. I mean, it's ridiculous. And yeah, he'll sometimes have a few token leftists on, but he'll frame it in a way that always helps the Republican Party and that helped Donald Trump when Trump was in power. But let me continue here.
Incidents of war criminalization doesn't mean we have to back away.
But why this? Why wouldn't we deal with Maduro in Venezuela first? Well, Maduro destroyed a first world country, almost first world country. Maduro destroyed a first world country, almost first.
So then he says, why don't we deal with Maduro first? That is, why doesn't the U.S. overthrow the Venezuelan government because he supposedly destroyed his country? Full-on neocon rhetoric, and he's doing it in a way where he's like, I'm against the war in Syria, but that's because I want the war to come home. This is not anti-war. And there's so many of these clips. Here's another one. I mean, this is an incredible clip you found, Robbie. This is another 2018 clip of Tucker Carlson saying that in Venezuela, they eat zoo animals. Insane neocon propaganda.
Well, no country in the Western Hemisphere has failed more completely in more ways than Venezuela, sadly. Has a lot going for it. Had a huge...
First of all, that's insane. He mentioned, that El Salvador had a failed state. El Salvador had the highest murder rate on earth. El Salvador has been largely responsible for a huge immigration flow because of, not to mention the U.S. history of supporting the Civil War in El Salvador, or Honduras, where the U.S.-backed coup regime also led the country to having the highest murder rate on earth. But he says Venezuela is the worst. Again, neocon propaganda.
Well, no country in the Western Hemisphere has failed more completely in more ways than Venezuela, sadly. Has a lot going for it. Had a huge middle class. It has, of course, the world's largest proven oil reserves. Today, it can't even feed itself. There's no toilet paper some days in Caracas. They're eating zoo animals.
There's no toilet paper. They're eating zoo animals. I can assure everyone watching and listening, I've been to Venezuela numerous times. There is food, there is toilet paper. They're not eating zoo animals.
Has, of course, the world's largest proven oil reserves. Today, it can't even feed itself. There's no toilet paper some days in Caracas. They're eating zoo animals. What happened? Well, you know what happened. They implemented socialism, and there were obvious and predictable and disastrous consequences. But
he said, what happened? Socialism. No mention of the sanctions, no mention of the U.S. hybrid war, because he supports that war on Venezuela.
That's not the whole story of what happened there. 6 years ago, the government of Venezuela passed a gun ban specifically designed to disarm the public. It, of course, did not make people safer. Venezuela is one of the highest murder rates in the world. That wasn't the point of it. The point was to make the people powerless, and it definitely did that. As one terrified Venezuelan put it, quote, people never would have believed they needed to defend themselves against the government. But of course, they did. In the past 2 years, almost 200 protesters, pro-democracy protesters, have been murdered by the security forces of dictator Nicolas Maduro.
Straight up fake statistic from one of these U.S. government-backed fake NGOs. And he also calls Maduro a dictator. Again, neocon rhetoric, straight up. This is a so-called right-wing populist.
In the past 2 years, almost 200 protesters, pro-democracy protesters, have been murdered by the security forces of dictator Nicolas Maduro. The government still has guns, of course. Authoritarians aren't stupid. They never give up their guns. That's rule one. So applies just as well to the United States as it does to failing socialist states. In New Jersey, ordinary citizens can go to prison for possessing gun magazines that hold too many rounds. Bernie Kerik is a former NYPD commissioner.
Yeah, so then he brings on an NYPD commissioner and talk about who this guy is.
Oh, yeah. Bernard Kerik is one of the craziest, it's probably one of the strangest appointments in the Bush administration. He was the NYPD commissioner, very close to Giuliani, kind of his bag man. He seems like a straight up mobster. He went to jail for taking bribes. He wrote like a book about how he left behind his Vietnamese daughter in Vietnam because he didn't realize he had like a child with somebody there. His story is very strange, but anyways, the strangest thing about him is that he immediately gets plucked by Rumsfeld to exclusively go to Iraq and essentially be the vice governor of Iraq under Paul Bremer, in charge of training the Iraqi police in Iraq. And there's also a strange connection between him and one of these kind of right populist think tanks, the Manhattan Institute, which largely sponsored all these Disney leaks coming out by Chris Rufo. They actually were hired to work with Bernard Kerik to train the NYPD on anti-terrorism tactics in the early Bush administration. So the Manhattan Institute worked with Bernard Kerik. It's a whole bunch of weird stuff there, but basically, yeah, he's a crazy neocon guy who's linked with Rudy Giuliani and worked under Paul Bremer in Iraq.
Yeah, so these are the neocons that so-called right-wing populist Tucker Carlson brings on his show. I mean, you have so many clips of these. I'm going to play another clip here, and then I'll have you comment on it about Elliot Abrams. You mentioned, Tucker had been writing alongside Elliot Abrams back in the Weekly Standard. Of course, Elliot Abrams is this notorious war criminal who used so-called humanitarian aid convoys of flights of the CIA cutout USAID to send weapons to the Contras in Nicaragua. I mean, of course, he was at the center of Iran-Contra. So here's Tucker Carlson attacking Ilhan Omar for criticizing war criminal Elliot Abrams. And you point out that Tucker Carlson brought up Stacey Abrams 7 times more than neocon Elliot Abrams, since Elliot Abrams was appointed to the State Department under Donald Trump, of course. And what was Elliot Abrams doing under Trump? Overseeing the Venezuela coup attempt, just as he had overseen the terrorist war on Nicaragua. So here's a clip from 2019 from Tucker Carlson.
Congresswoman Omar is starting a lot of fights recently. For a newcomer, she's in the center of many news stories. Today on Capitol Hill, she berated the new envoy to Venezuela, Elliot Abrams, accusing him of being a liar and attacking him over the Iran-Contra affair that took place more than 30 years ago. Here's part of it.
Do you think that massacre was a fabulous achievement that happened under our watch?
That is a ridiculous question, and I
yes or no?
No.
I will.
Sorry, Mr.
I will take that as a yes.
Congresswoman Omar is herself, of course, a refugee to this country. She was born in Mogadishu. She spent most of her time, at least her political life, attacking this country as immoral. Congressman,
So he's criticizing that she's attacking the U.S. government over its war crimes. And I mean, there's so many of these. Here's another one.
really quick, we're almost out of time. Elliot Abrams, who served in the last Bush administration, is under consideration to become Deputy Secretary of State. You wrote this: crack the door to admit Elliot Abrams, and the neocons will become scurrying in by the hundreds.
Yeah, I think someone who was a never Trumper, someone who never be in a Trump State Department. I mean, for goodness sakes. But he also represents things that Donald Trump doesn't. President Trump has been different than many. He said that nation building hasn't worked. When he said that, Elliot Abrams came forward and said, he's absolutely wrong. Nation building is what we need to do. Regime change, Iraq war. Elliot Abrams was one of the key architects of the Iraq war. We don't need people with the failed policies back in. Trump does represent something new and different from policy, and I think a welcome relief from the neocons. So I hope he doesn't appoint somebody who doesn't really agree with him.
I'm baffled by it. I got to be honest. Senator Paul, thanks a lot.
So he was baffled by it, but then here his on his same show, here is promoting Elliot Abrams again.
Diplomatic relations between the United States and Venezuela are continuing to deteriorate tonight. The U.S. no longer recognizes Nicolas Maduro as president of that country. In response to that, Venezuela has ordered American diplomats to leave Venezuela. The U.S. has not complied. The Trump administration now says, quote, all options are on the table regarding Venezuela. Could this lead to a military conflict of some kind with that country? Fox News chief intelligence correspondent Catherine Herridge has been following the situation in Venezuela very closely, and she joins us tonight with the report. Catherine?
Thank you, Tucker, and good evening. Venezuela is much more than a regional conflict, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo confirming that Iran has a significant footprint in Venezuela and other Latin American nations.
So full-on anti-Iran neocon propaganda saying Venezuela is a threat because Iran. I mean, right on Tucker Carlson's show. Listen to this insane shit.
Iran has a significant footprint in Venezuela and other Latin American nations through the terrorist group Hezbollah. The FBI is seeking information about an operative, Ghazi Nasser al-Din, who is tied to Hezbollah and has Syrian and Venezuelan passports. Based on recent intelligence, Nasser al-Din was operating from Venezuela. Sanctioned by the Treasury Department, he has at least 10 aliases, and he's linked to clandestine networks in Syria that amplified the violence and fueled the Syrian refugee crisis, eventually drawing in the U.S., Russia, and Iran.
Wow. She says that Hezbollah is what is responsible for the refugee crisis in Syria, and it drew in the U.S., not mentioning, the U.S. weapons that went to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the U.S. so-called moderate rebels who were allied with Al-Qaeda. But this is this insane neocon propaganda on Tucker Carlson's show. Let me continue here.
And he's linked to clandestine networks in Syria that amplified the violence and fueled the Syrian refugee crisis, eventually drawing in the U.S., Russia, and Iran. National security experts said a similar scenario may be playing out in Venezuela. Latest projections from the Brookings Institution, a Washington, D.C. think tank, are 8.2 million refugees and migrants may leave Venezuela. That is 25% of the current population. And now Russia, China, and Cuba are backing the Maduro regime.
Russia, China, and Cuba are backing the Maduro regime. This is Tucker Carlson's show.
Population. And now Russia, China, and Cuba are backing the Maduro regime. In his most recent interview, President Trump left the military option open, but significantly made no commitments, Tucker.
Catherine Herridge, a story we will continue to follow. Thank you very much for that.
So, I mean, that is straight up classical neocon propaganda. I mean, just comment on that, Robbie.
I mean, it goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning, that it does seem like really the only fundamental difference between some of these hawks is that they have different timelines for which countries they want to go after. It's like he's saying, like, why are we worried about Syria and when we should be worrying about Venezuela? It's like in our hemisphere. So like a lot, I've noticed over the years, especially since Trump, there has been this attempt made, because a lot of sort of neocons like Max Boot, Bill Kristol, Robert Kagan have presented themselves as more liberal. Like, for example, Bill Kristol is now pro Roe versus Wade and gay marriage, even though he wrote against both very vociferously back when he was writing for the Weekly Standard. So there's this perception now, and I run into this all the time, where people think the neocons are all liberals. They're all Democrats now. All the neocons are Democrats. There are no neocons in the Republican Party, people will say. And that's because I think they're using a very narrow definition of what a neocon is. It's more of this sort of liberal interventionist mindset that comes from, sort of the Irving Kristol, the Trotskyite lineage. And so a lot of these people will even go as far as saying, like, actually, the neocons are really just all communist. They're commies. You even see some like libertarians saying that. Well, what that does is it omits like an entire other side of, let's just focus on Project for the New American Century, the most infamous neocon think tank that had 17 of its signatories and members go into the Bush administration and become very influential policymakers within the Bush administration. If you want to call those people neocons, let's just start there. Well, I'd say about 30% of them have drifted into this world of what could be called the populist right now. That includes people like Michael Ledeen, like James Woolsey, like William Bennett, like Frank Gaffney. And Frank Gaffney has a very influential think tank called the Center for Security Policy, where Gordon Chang, for example, does a lot of writing. Now, Gordon Chang is one of the most aggressively anti-China neocons there is, and he's a regular guest on the Tucker Carlson program. Tucker Carlson also regularly features people from the Committee on the Present Danger China, a mixture between some of those kind of fringy PNAC neocons, that 30% I was talking about, and the right populist, sort of the Bannonites. Then you have the Hudson Institute, which is sort of a coalescence of all the factions. You sort of have the PNAC neocons in there. Scooter Libby is the vice chair. Mike Pompeo is now a big part of Hudson. Also with some of these more hawkish neoliberals like Robert Kagan, and right populists like Sagar Anjeti, who wants to call himself a populist. So you have places like that having a lot of influence. And then you also have the Claremont Institute, which has its own outlet called American Greatness. And William Bennett, another one of these PNAC anti-China guys, sits on the board for the Claremont Institute. So I do think there's a lot of stuff here happening in the shadows that people are willfully ignoring or just not wanting to see, or using a very, very narrow definition of neocon so that they don't have to talk about how there are still very hawkish, far-right neocons who are gunning for China. And I just watched a really interesting clip from Fred Kagan right after the Russia invaded Ukraine. He was sort of complaining about how the entire DC think tank circuit is now focused on China like a laser beam. And I don't think that most people really perceive it that way. Most people, if you're really looking at this from the outside, think that it's mostly the right-wing media that's pushing for escalations with China. But according to Fred Kagan, someone who's on the inside of this, the entire DC think tank apparatus is focusing on China like a laser beam. And I think that really goes to show that it's not some partisan split about this. It's just rhetorical differences. I mean, both sides of this, if you want to split it into a partisan fashion, want war, but yet Tucker and his sort of ilk present themselves as being the less war hungry faction somehow. Even though it really does, you can throw a lot more evidence onto the pile. It really does appear that he's actually deliberately pushing for some kind of war agenda on China, on Venezuela. And it is sort of interesting that his father, did his father influence him to do that because his father was so involved in Radio Marti and Radio Beijing? I don't know. But I do think Tucker is carrying out some kind of agenda. I don't even think this is in any way, shape, or form his own twisted self-perception of some kind of populist framing. I think that this is, I really do believe he is carrying out some kind of agenda. I'm not saying he's directly working for the CIA or anything like that, but these are talking points that are being filtered to his show, through his show, from basically think tanks. And, a lot of these same think tanks that we're already familiar with. And his father, Dick Carlson, actually was a director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, one of these really hawkish neocon think tanks that have pivoted towards China now. And he also hosted a show for the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, Dick Carlson did, with a CIA agent. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how many CIA agents, people who fought in the Contra War are hanging out at Dick Carlson's house for family parties. But, I mean, you got to imagine that this whole notion that somehow Carlson is fighting the deep state or anything like that, I mean, it's just complete BS. I mean, it just should be it falls apart immediately when you look at any of this evidence.
Yeah, I think what's pretty clear to me is that, like I said, there's a split, a division within the ruling class. And there are conservatives who want to ally with Russia against China. They see Russia as a bastion of Christianity, maybe even whiteness. And they see China as this communist, godless, atheistic, non-white country that's threatening the West. And Tucker Carlson, who's a straight up white supremacist, he constantly says that there's a liberal conspiracy to make the U.S. Non-white by immigration from the third world. I'll get to that in a second. Just straight up, just racist, great replacement theory, straight up white supremacist propaganda. But meanwhile, he's also saying, he said explicitly, China is, quote, the greatest threat to democracy and freedom worldwide. I mean, that is as neocon as it gets. This is a clip from 2020 from Tucker. This is from Fox News. This is like straight up neocon propaganda injected into your veins. Like, this is not even subtle. I'm going to listen to the intro of this.
In the Wall Street Journal, there was a kind of remark. So last week in the Wall Street Journal, there was a kind of remarkable op-ed stating as clearly as anyone has ever stated the nature of the threat that we face from China. The op-ed was written by someone who would know, the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe.
So Tucker is quoting the Director of National Intelligence, the guy who oversees the CIA and all other spy agencies. And then, by the way, he later invites him onto his show to talk about why China is a threat. So this is Tucker allying with the CIA to talk about how evil China is.
He called the Communist Party of, quote, National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe. He called the Communist Party of China, quote, the greatest threat to democracy and freedom worldwide since World War II. It's an amazing piece, worth your time if you haven't read it.
It's an amazing piece. He's endorsing this spy agency director who oversees the CIA. He's endorsing this article saying that China is the biggest threat to the West.
In just a moment, we'll have Director Ratcliffe on to discuss that. He wrote this, quote, the intelligence is clear. Beijing intends to dominate the United States and the rest of the planet economically, militarily, and technologically. I call its approach of economic espionage, rob, replicate, and replace.
So, I mean, Tucker, rightfully, he was skeptical of U.S. so-called intelligence when it came to Russiagate, which was an obviously, a completely bogus intelligence agency disinformation campaign led by the CIA. But now he's saying, we have to believe the U.S. intelligence because the intelligence is clear. China's a threat. So the CIA is bad when it says, Trump's a Putin puppet, but the CIA is good when it says China is big, bad, evil boogeyman.
China robs U.S. companies of their intellectual property, replicates the technology, and then replaces the U.S. firms in the global marketplace.
Now he supports U.S. corporations. He sometimes claims to be against, big corporations and big tech. Now here's Tucker complaining about China, communist China, violating intellectual property. Who's going to think about the capitalist intellectual property, Robbie?
Those aren't simply legal disputes. They have actual consequences for millions of American workers on our standard of living, on what your kids will do for a living.
So once again, we see this fake populist tactic of claiming to care about workers, but the enemy of workers are not capitalists and the big corporations. The enemies are China and immigrants, of course. And just a few more minutes, another minute here.
Ratcliffe noted that in 2018, a Chinese wind turbine manufacturer ripped off trade secrets from a Massachusetts-based infrastructure company called American Semiconductor. As a direct result of that theft, American Semiconductor lost over $1 billion in value and had to cut 700 jobs. Now, that didn't happen because the company, American Semiconductor, was careless. It happened because they were the victim of theft. That's happening everywhere, including in the Pentagon. According to Ratcliffe, quote, China also steals sensitive U.S. defense technology to fuel President Xi Jinping's aggressive plan to make China the world's foremost military power. U.S. intelligence shows that China has even conducted human testing.
Okay. U.S. intelligence claims China is conducting human testing. So rightfully, he says we should be skeptical about the CIA on Russiagate, but now we're supposed to believe the CIA when it says that China's doing human testing. I mean, again, neocon propaganda.
That China has even conducted human testing on members of the People's Liberation Army in the hope of developing soldiers with a biologically enhanced capability.
Robbie, they're literal Antifa super soldiers. China is making the Antifa super soldiers, according to the CIA and Tucker Carlson. And this shit just keeps going on.
Remarkable.
There are no ethical boundaries to Beijing's pursuit of power.
Remarkable.
Remarkable.
We know where this is leading, and Ratcliffe's op-ed spells it out. Quote, Beijing is preparing for
more bullshit.
And take action to it with more intelligence before him than anyone on the globe apart from the president. We're happy to have him on tonight. Director, thanks so much for coming on.
Tucker, good to see you.
You spell this out so clearly that it made me wonder why the rest of us, so many in our public life, haven't been saying this for quite some time. You make it sound obvious.
So, I mean, just praising this spy agency director and being like, man, why isn't everyone saying that China is the biggest threat to the world? I mean, you also mentioned, this should be even more embarrassing, is that Tucker has had on Gordon Chang. And look, I love this image here, this screenshot from a MAGA Patriot account. Look at this. It says Gordon Chang, author of Coming Collapse of China. Now, they don't mention that Coming Collapse of China was published in 2001. And in that book, Gordon Chang, this neocon, claimed that China was going to collapse by 2011. And then he was called out and he said, well, fine, it's going to collapse in 2012. Meanwhile, Tucker has him on to talk about how supposedly Western corporations are using Uyghur slave labor, supposedly. I mean, again, this is as neocon as it gets. Talk about Tucker's coverage of China. I mean, this is straight up neocon propaganda.
I mean, this is when I was watching Tucker a little bit on and off just because I typically do watch like right-wing media that people, will tell me it's good. You got to check this out. I would just sort of watch it with this, detached perspective to see what Tucker was talking about. And he was talking about this a little bit before the pandemic, but it really kicked up into high gear after COVID-19 hit. It was almost like, people call Rachel Maddow, Rachel Maddow has now become sort of epitomizes like a crazy hysteric on Russiagate, and rightfully so. She's put out a lot of very vitriolic, hysterical propaganda about Putin, very paranoid things that a lot of which, have been proven to be false. But yet Tucker has this reputation for being anti-war, and, his program is the most watched cable news show on television. Most watched news show on TV, and he's able to basically do what she does on MSNBC with Russia. He does it with China, an equal amount of hysterical, paranoid rhetoric, and yet he doesn't have that reputation. People don't see him that way. I like to call him the Rachel Maddow of Chinagate, even though Chinagate's not like necessarily a thing. I mean, that's
no,
what...
it is Tucker. Tucker. Oh God, it is Robbie. China. He's been pushing this whole China virus shit. Tucker has repeatedly said the Communist Party of China unleashed COVID on us as an attack. That's his version of Chinagate.
This is something very interesting because, like, I've studied like the 2001 anthrax attacks and how that, most people agree, most experts who've looked into it agree that it came from a U.S. government facility. We still don't really know how it got out. The FBI blamed Bruce Ivan. So I've always been open to the idea of a general lab leak or, a pathogen escaping from a lab. So when it came to like the original narratives that I saw coming through not just his program, but from people part of this think tank, the Committee on the Present Danger China, it was originally framed. And I would say Tom Cotton was probably the most public face who delivered sort of these talking points for these think tanks. But it was originally framed as the Chinese government was working on bioweapons, and this was made by the Chinese government. This is a bioweapon, and it may have even been released deliberately, like as some kind of I don't know what kind of warfare they were trying to call it, like for China to basically like shut down the world. And this was the framing initially that was coming out through places like Tucker Carlson's program. And over time, that lab leak narrative has evolved more, and I think rightfully so. Even though I'm not of the mindset to think it's a lab leak, I think that a lot of, if you want to look at the potential suspects for that, a lot of the fingers end up actually pointing at people inside the U.S. government and people and American companies like EcoHealth Alliance, not the CCP or not even like Chinese companies. Like nobody's. So this framing very early on, I think, was very weaponized, very deliberate. The people who probably put it out knew about, the American companies involved. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to make it seem like it was all about this Chinese woman, this bat lady, they would call her, this scientist. And it all became this sort of this very, kind of almost like a spy novel, like all these Chinese scientists who were connected to the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party were trying to hide all this stuff. And maybe they were behind it, and that was the original framing. And Tucker continued to push very distorted lab leak framing. When I say distorted, I mean like even way out of the norm of what is even like the consensus lab leak theory now that most people who believe that push. He was pushing a whistleblower named Li Mengyao, who was by all accounts a total fraud. No one knows if she had any connection whatsoever to like anything that happened at that Wuhan lab. And all of a sudden she sort of popped out of nowhere, linked up with Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon, and later was found to have been also funded by Miles Guo, a mysterious fugitive Chinese billionaire who has been bankrolling Steve Bannon pretty much for the last few decades, to the tune of about $1 to $2 million a year. This is the same Chinese billionaire that had the yacht where Steve Bannon was arrested off the coast of Rhode Island. But this whistleblower that Tucker had on, named Li Mengyao, is all of her information, even by people who believe in the lab leak consensus, has like debunked her entirely. Like that she has been identified as some kind of fraud. People don't even really understand why she got into the mix initially. So it's not even that Tucker was trying to push like, this may have leaked from the Wuhan lab theory. He was pushing like weaponized fake whistleblowers who are like just complete cutouts, almost like more absurd than like Curveball or anybody like from the Iraq war pushing WMD stuff. So, I mean, he got into some really dirty troughs when it came to like, pouring out anti-Chinese propaganda. And this, I think this example you're showing is probably one of the most egregious in terms of being like the phoniest.
Yeah, her name is Li Mengyan.
Mengyan.
And they describe her as a Chinese virologist whistleblower. This is on Tucker Carlson in 2022 on Fox News, called "Coronavirus Whistleblower Speaks About Possible COVID Origin" on Tucker. I mean, straight up shady neocon propaganda. But I want to play two more clips, and then we can focus on other people. We talk a lot about Tucker. I think it's important because he gets portrayed as so-called anti-war, even like, 1% of the time, 99% of the time he has on these insane right-wingers. 1% of the time he has on like a few token leftists, and people are like, oh my God, Tucker Carlson had on, he's anti-war because he had on a leftist one time. And it's like, no. Meanwhile, right after he has like a white supremacist segment about how like immigrants are trying to like kill white people and like turn the US into like a third world country or something. But listen to some of this insane neocon propaganda on Tucker. So this is Caitlin Johnstone pointed out. And again, I mean, people in the comments are saying, well, where in MSNBC do they call out the Cold War in China? None of us is defending MSNBC. All of us obviously are against MSNBC. I call it MSNBCIA. But this is why this is like this lesser evilism has melted people's brains and they're trying to defend Fox. It's so crazy. Here's a clip from Caitlin Johnstone. She points out that this is easily as deranged as anything we've seen on MSNBC about Russia.
Brian Dean Wright is a Democrat and a former CIA officer. We're happy to have him tonight.
So Tucker has on a so-called former CIA agent.
Brian, thanks a lot for coming on. It's striking to me, and it's a matter of public record, that the Chinese government is attempting to leverage its relations with our elected officials to control how we talk about a virus they unleashed on the world. How do you...
So there he says, the Chinese government unleashed the virus on the world, and they're now trying to prevent us from talking about that. And again, this guy is a so-called former CIA agent.
Feel when you hear that? How can anybody not feel outraged? You know, we all know.
Wow. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed, Robbie, but in the lower third, it actually provides more info. Not only is he a former CIA agent, he did CIA ops. This is not just an analyst. This guy is a straight up, coup plotter style CIA agent doing operations, not just an analyst.
Oh, we've all lived in a country for the past 30 years that has been sold out to the Chinese government. We were promised in the late 1990s that, hey, China.
Okay, the CIA spook says that the U.S. was sold out to China.
Sold out to the Chinese government. We were promised in the late 1990s that, hey, China goes in the WTO and we'll all benefit. That didn't take place. We've watched our intellectual property be stolen for 30 years.
Who will think of the intellectual property, Robbie, of all these big tech corporations? Rightfully, one day Tucker will criticize big tech. I mean, rightfully. And then now he's like, well, the evil Chi-Coms are stealing their intellectual property. Who's going to think about Google's intellectual property?
And now we watch some of our elected leaders, I'm sorry to say, many of them on my side of the aisle, capitulate to the Chinese government once again. I mean, here we are, 30 years, and we've learned nothing. So I'm outraged. It makes me incredibly angry. It seems like a pretty straightforward question. So we reached out to Senator Feinstein and a number of other elected officials today and asked, have you had contact recently since the outbreak with Chinese officials? And not a single one responded. What do you think we should infer from that? I think that they're nervous. I think there are a bunch of people who, because they're either useful idiots or they have some degree of knowledge and relationships behind the scenes with the Chinese government. Some of them, in fact, could be Chinese agents of the actual.
Oh my God.
So there we go. We have a so-called former CIA agent who did his CIA ops on Tucker Carlson, claiming that U.S. government officials are secretly working for China. They're secret Chinese agents.
Behind the scenes with the Chinese government. Some of them, in fact, could be Chinese agents of the actual MSS, their intelligence service, God forbid. They're nervous. And they know that if nothing else, the party has, certainly for the past 3 months, doubled down on their pro-China rhetoric. And if the U.S. intelligence community...
Wait, where the hell is this Democratic Party pro-China rhetoric? All Biden has done since he came into power is anti-China policies. I mean, go ahead.
You can replace China with Russia with everything he's saying, and it sounds virtually identical to some kind of Rachel Maddow paranoid powwow. Like saying that all these Democratic politicians, because they're not openly out there bashing China, that they must be some kind of they're agents of influence by the CCP. I mean, it's absolutely identical to a lot of the same stuff that you heard repeated by some of these crazier Democrats and intel officials who go on MSNBC. That's what I don't understand. I mean, I'm just responding to some of the comments I'm seeing now. It's like, people continually praise Tucker Carlson for being the only, they call him the only anti-war voice who's anti the Ukrainian war on TV. I mean, if that's your bar, I mean, I just do think we are in such a state of desperation that it's like, we don't need to scrape the bottom of the barrel for like consistent and strong anti-war voices. Just look at what he's doing with that segment. He is literally brainwashing his viewers into just being paranoid about another country, just not Russia. I mean, I just don't see how that's a net positive, even if you're looking at it from the perspective of, well, at least he's anti, the war in Ukraine. It's like, well, then he's filling people's heads with ideas of being paranoid about China instead. I mean, how is that a net positive if you're just looking at it only from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, no rational person can say that that's an anti-war perspective because it's not anti-war. He's only against the specific conflict, the proxy conflict with Russia, because he instead wants a war on China and on Iran and Venezuela and Cuba. That's not anti-war. I mean, being opposed to one particular conflict doesn't make you anti-war, as we began this discussion pointing out. But so one other clip I'm going to play here, which this clip got a little more coverage, and people said, well, Glenn Greenwald was trying to defend Tucker Carlson, was saying, well, Tucker didn't say this, his guest said it. But yeah, I mean, obviously Tucker has no control over his guests, clearly. It's called the Tucker Carlson Show, but Tucker Carlson has no influence over who he invites on the show that's named after him. This is an insane neocon saying that the U.S. military should be sitting on a throne of Chinese skulls. This is in addition to the insanely misogynist shit that he says in this.
Just really simple. Do you think the key to remaining competitive with the Chinese military is more gender advisors?
Oh, there's no question, Tucker. I mean, China right now and Russia, they're both testing hypersonic missiles that can turn New York City to ash.
Okay, this neocon on Tucker says that China and Russia are threatening to turn New York City into ash. And so he's criticizing so-called wokeness, which means being accepting of LGBT people, by saying that it's bad. Wokeness is bad because it hurts the U.S. war machine. In that case, bring me more wokeness. I've been critical of like the superficial neoliberal corporate wokeness, but if wokeness actually is going to hurt the U.S. war machine, hell yeah, bring me more wokeness.
Russia is actually developing and has developed satellites that can push our satellites out of orbit and completely cripple our military. Our military, though, they're focused on the important things. We want to focus on climate change, and we definitely have to make sure there are enough tampons in the restrooms at the Pentagon.
That's kind of what they're saying. I mean, I don't know. There's a psychological term for this, and it escapes my memory at the moment, but where there's a massive real threat that you can't deal with, so you screw.
And of course, when he says that massive real threat, he means China.
That you can't deal with, so you scurry off and deal with imaginary threats to make yourself feel in control. That kind of feels like what we're watching.
Well, what we're watching is the destruction of the U.S. military, and what we're going to end up seeing, Tucker, is thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Americans die. Those are the
hundreds of thousands of Americans are going to die because the U.S. military is slightly more accepting to LGBT people.
Stakes of the game we're playing here. We don't need a military that's woman friendly. We don't need a military that's gay friendly, with all due respect to the Air Force. We need a military that's flat out hostile. We need a military full of type A men who want to sit on a throne of Chinese skulls. But we don't have that now. We can't even get women off naval vessels. That should be step one, but most of them are already pregnant anyway.
Wait, so I'm confused. I was told by Glenn Greenwald and these other charlatans who are just full-on Republican apologists at this point, that Tucker Carlson is anti-war, but I'm confused. I actually watched that segment, and he's saying that the reason wokeness is bad is because it hurts the U.S. military and hurts the war machine, and his guest that he invited on says the U.S. military should be sitting on a throne of Chinese skulls. How can anyone watch that and come away still believing this bullshit narrative that Tucker is anti-war?
I mean, willful ignorance, maliciousness, bad faith behavior is 3 different possible answers to your question. I mean, it was really shocking actually to see Glenn Greenwald doubling down as recently as like this week, saying that Tucker Carlson has like basically repudiated his past. He knows he made mistakes in the past, and he's sort of, I don't know the exact words he used, but he was implying that somehow Tucker Carlson has cleansed himself of these sins of being a neocon. And I don't see any evidence of that whatsoever. It's like, is it just because he says some boilerplate anti-war talking points on some issues that we automatically must assume that he's repudiated his past neocon statements? In fact, the most recent one that comes to mind is when he was asked to address his statement that kind of leaked off of that. I think it was like that radio show, Mad Cow or whatever that idiot's name is, from a few years ago, saying that Iraqis were semi-literate primitive monkeys that should shut up and obey, talking about like how they should behave in the face of American occupation. He kind of laughed it off and didn't repudiate anything he said, and just kind of acted like the cancel culture brigade was coming for him. So I have no idea what the hell Glenn Greenwald is talking about. I think Glenn Greenwald is just making this up out of whole cloth to, I don't know what. I mean, at this point, I honestly don't know why Glenn Greenwald is even saying that. No one would believe that in the face of all this evidence. There is no there is no example other than, if you want to point to Tucker Carlson's book, Ship of Fools, where he bashes Bill Kristol and talks about what it was like to work at the Weekly Standard and how he doesn't agree with that anymore. I mean, I guess you can lean on that and be like, oh, he's repudiated his neocon ways. But like, that to me just seems like a really clever sort of optical rebranding exercise in his book itself. It's pretty much substance free. He doesn't concede anything that really makes him look that bad at all. And he omits a hell of a lot to sort of make it seem like he was never really a neocon ever. It's just, he just happened to work for and be close to all these hardcore neocons. And in fact, he really, thought they were kind of arrogant the whole time, and he never really agreed with them, even though there's just all these, pieces of evidence that he did. And lucky for him, he worked at different, media channels before YouTube was around. So he worked a gig at CNN. He did Crossfire for several years, and he moved to MSNBC. So there are plenty of clips of him out there advocating for the Iraq war, a war on Iran. There's a clip from Fox News where he says that he thinks Iran is crazy, and he thinks that they should be annihilated, that we should essentially kill them all. And this is just normal things that he would put out there. I mean, I think I sent you these before we even got started. I don't know if we have time to play them, but there's like clips from, CNN during the Iraq war where he's defending the Freedom Fries anti-French smear campaign because they voted against the UN Security Council vote to invade. And also just, him sitting side by side with neocons like Clifford May from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, sort of gleefully acting excited that, all this looting is happening to like Saddam's palaces, when in fact, in reality, what was really happening was there's a lot of like historical artifacts, like Babylonian ancient artifacts being pillaged and destroyed by US soldiers around that time too, that he doesn't talk about. But then he ends one of these segments by saying like, well, we know one thing for sure is that the moment that Saddam's gone is going to be like better for the Iraqi people, like forever. Like there's no question about that. So
I'll play those clips.
He was there with all these other psychotic, neocons that were saying the same lies about the Iraq war back then.
Yeah, I'll play those clips. Again, for everyone watching or listening, Robbie is a masterful researcher. He's found these incredible clips that I don't think people have published before. So this is Tucker defending the insane neocon Freedom Fries campaign back when he worked at CNN.
Welcome back to CNN's coverage.
And back when he always wore a bow tie, like a true working class man of the people.
Of the New Iraq, I'm Tucker Carlson. So just how bad are U.S.-French relations? Well, if French wine sales in the U.S. are any indication, and they are, it seems as though there are still some sour grapes on both sides. Is it time for France and the U.S. to French kiss and make up?
Am I going to go to France? I don't think so.
Well, let me just... Amen. Now, Martin Walker, when the NAACP initiates a boycott of the state of South Carolina because the Confederate battle flag is flown above their state house, liberals say, well, that's an act of principle, and it's a fundamentally, intrinsically a good thing. When ordinary Americans switch to California wine because France sided with Saddam Hussein before this war, liberals say, well, that's outrageous. That's a kind of censorship. Why is that?
I'm not sure they do say that.
When we come back, should Freedom Fries become French fries once again? We'll be right back.
The last thing he says is...
You said a moment ago that we shouldn't rub the French noses in our victory, rather large French noses. We should be magnanimous in victory, and we should make up with France. My question is, why? The French government backed Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein lost. Why should the French government profit from the reconstruction of Iraq?
And here's another clip you sent.
CNN's coverage of war in Iraq continues.
Welcome back to CNN's continuing coverage of the war. I'm Tucker Carlson. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld today said looting in Baghdad is just part of the price of liberating Iraq. But just how bad is the looting? And is it the job of the U.S. military to get that looting under control?
I'm not against all the looting, to tell you the truth. If you're talking about looting Saddam's palaces or Tariq Aziz's homes, I say go for it. You're just taking back what's yours. And in some neighborhoods, as far as I understand, they're not looting residential neighborhoods. Now, where that's taking place, that's regrettable. But, that probably happened in Paris, too.
That's exactly right. PJ, isn't this standing...
I love this propaganda. It's not happening, but, if it were happening, it would still be justified.
Right, PJ, isn't
I
this
thought
getting...
Republicans were for law and order.
There are exceptions.
I think they are, but let's put this in some context and perspective. 30 years of tyranny the Iraqi people have lived under. They've been liberated about 30 hours. In many ways, wouldn't you expect worse? This is no big deal, is it?
You've seen riots in the southern region as we now start to take sides. From this point on, we start to step on toes. We start to compete with people who want to control Iraq's wealth.
But nobody disagrees with that, PJ. But as a longtime military man, I think you will concede that the easy part is maybe a little glib. I mean, there were many things that could have gone wrong. Many Americans, of course, did die. And in fact, the military campaign was a striking success. Shouldn't we recognize it? And moreover, should we recognize that there haven't been a lot of revenge killings, the sort of thing you would expect from the Iraqis? And should we celebrate that? Two headlines I see this week. One, the incredible gratitude the Iraqi people obviously feel toward American troops. And two, the incredible indifference these scenes have been greeted with by liberals.
So incredible footage you found showing Tucker. I mean, he was just a full-up neocon. And again, you know, I'm sympathetic to the argument that people can change. Obviously, I don't think people's political views are set in stone. They can change. But as we just spent the last hour showing with constant clips, yes, Tucker claims to now be against neocons, but all he's doing is just rebranding neoconservatism. There's been a split in the neocon movement, and there are some neocons who join the Democratic Party who tend to be who think that a war with Russia is more important. And he's just part of the faction of the neocons in the Republican Party who now think that the war on China is more important.
Yeah, I mean that's what it seems like to me. I mean, and it's strange because people like Rand Paul and Thomas Massey, like I was mentioning at the beginning of this, they originally started way more anti-war or further away from where Tucker is. And like you can see it in that Rand Paul clip, even though you played it out of order, the clip of Rand Paul talking to Tucker about how he's worried about Elliott Abrams, it seems like both of them are largely in agreement that Trump might be screwing himself by hiring on like a classic Reagan neocon. But then you see just 2 years later, it's like it never happened. I mean, so once Trump did take on Elliott Abrams, both of them said nothing. And I think at that point, it's pretty obvious that Tucker Carlson and Rand Paul had gotten sucked into the orbit of like the Trump executive office itself. I mean, we already heard that we already know that Tucker Carlson was constantly on the phone with Trump, maybe even helping him make policy decisions. Rand Paul somehow bought Trump's lie about ending the war in Afghanistan and helped him sell that, even though he never pulled out. So, you know, you could see these spheres of influence sucking in pretty much everybody from the Republican Party. I don't know exactly who's sort of at the top of this pyramid. I would say that there's sort of there's something else embedded in this that I think is also important to mention. And it's this idea that America has sort of become cucked, that America no longer has this agency, that we are no longer strong. And this also sort of plays into, you know, what Tucker's saying about like the Chinese government stealing our tech and using it against us, and how they're now somehow have power to indoctrinate our children and censor our movies and all these things. This is all playing into this idea that America is losing its supremacy. And that perception is inherently, on some level, it's neocon, because it's not just about, you know, we got to protect ourselves and, you know, make sure we're taken care of here, which I guess you can argue is some aspect of America first. What I'm describing is inherently about America's hegemonic duty, you know, that somehow we're the ones who need to have literally be influencing the rest of the world, and as like some shining beacon through our basically imperial footprint. So on some level, going back to what you said a while back into this episode, it is inherently imperialistic, even within like the sort of the, you know, this quasi war frame they're pushing. And I think that that's what's very interesting about all of it. And I mean, these neocon factions that are pushing for war with China now, I mean, it's fascinating because some of them will act like they hate neocons. I get in arguments with some of these guys from Gaffney's think tank all the time who the word neocon, they're allergic to it. They don't want people to see them that way. They refuse to use that label now because they understand how toxic it is. Much in the same way that like Robert Kagan understood that, like, his way of dealing with that is being like, what does that even mean anymore? He's like, I don't even know what neocon means. These far right, right populist acting neocons, they'll be like, fuck the neocons, but we also need to go to war with China. So they'll take both rhetorical frames, and it just sort of, again, it's just, you cannot trust it on its face. And that's why I think it's more important than ever in this, especially like in this newer, more inflated alternative media landscape, to really vet people, especially new people, media pundits, alt media figures, YouTubers, politicians, anybody, to see if they actually have like a consistent or core anti-war ideology, or if they're just throwing out something that sounds good. Because frankly, war does not pull very high. Most people in general do not want war. That is, unless you ask about specific conflicts at specific times, the general consensus in this country is that most people do not want that. So it makes sense why it would just become sort of a rhetorical tool, to gain credibility, but really there's no meaning behind it. And, I even saw Glenn arguing with you on Twitter saying like that Ukraine is the war right now, that there is no war with China. There is no war with these other places. I mean, what do people, I just don't understand how you can have that mindset either, because it's not like the United States only does one war at a time, or, only focuses in one single area at a time. We're doing it everywhere. We're trying to creep into so many different, wars, if you want to call them that it's just kind of a weird way to sort of deny a lot of what we've been talking about, that just because Tucker is talking about one of the, a very dangerous escalation that's happening right now, in a way that other media pundits are not, it just doesn't mean that he's fundamentally anti-war, that he should be celebrated. It's like, why don't we at least just talk about, like, if you take that perspective, at least acknowledge, I think this is good, but also what he's doing here is bad. And what you see increasingly is people like Glenn and other people who share Glenn's mindset, especially on the left, like refuse to even acknowledge any of the bad that Tucker's doing. And I find that just very strange. And I don't know if they're doing that because they just want to keep getting booked on Tucker or what, but essentially it's creating a problem, because I think that, at least there needs to be more of an identification of how much of an influence Tucker is having over this anti-China rhetoric. Because that, to me, I see as probably the biggest influence he's having on the dangerous side, if you want to call it that. So, again, I just don't understand, even if you like Tucker, why this discussion is somehow off the table. It's like, there should be no sacred cows, on mainstream media. It's like, why are we putting him up on a pedestal? It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I'll say, I think a lot of it is people, they have extremely low expectations. So they see someone who says something mildly critical of the U.S. war in Syria, and they're like, wow, he's anti-war. But in reality, no. He, again, cynically criticizes one U.S. war, while instead saying the reason this war is bad is because the U.S. should be waging war on another target. And not just China, but also immigrants. I mean, in addition to all the damage that Tucker has been doing, I mean, he really has been mainstreaming straight up white supremacist propaganda. Here is an Israeli newspaper pointing out how Tucker Carlson cited Israel itself to defend this straight up white supremacist replacement theory. So the ADL, I mean, again, it shows how the corporate media manufactures these ridiculously fake narratives it's like the culture war to distract people. So the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, is a pro-apartheid Israel lobby group. They spied on anti-apartheid South Africa activists. They spied on people in the 1980s who opposed the U.S. terror wars in Central America. So they criticized Tucker Carlson for citing straight up white supremacist propaganda. So then he responded saying, well, I'm just doing what Israel does. So praising Israel for its white supremacist policies. So here they point out that Tucker did an episode in which he said he claimed that there is a coordinated campaign to replace the population of the U.S. with immigrants from the third world, which is straight up just a version of the white supremacist replacement theory. And then the ADL, which again is a pro-apartheid Israel lobby group that has zero legitimacy, the ADL criticized him. So then he responded saying, now from Israel's perspective, this makes perfect sense. Why would any democratic nation make its own citizens less powerful? So he's defending it is unrealistic and unacceptable to accept the state of Israel to voluntarily subvert its own sovereign existence and nationalist identity and become a vulnerable minority within what was once its own territory. So
wow,
that's him citing Israel's racist apartheid policies to say that the U.S. should do the same thing for white people. So, I mean, we've been talking about how, Tucker has been claiming to be anti-war to try to push people who are anti-war into supporting war on China and also supporting war on immigrants. I mean, because war is not just between nations, it's also between classes, it's between people. And Tucker is saying, yeah, I'm against war with Russia and Syria. Instead, I want war on China and immigrants. That's not anti-war. That's another kind of war.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because he'll call himself a libertarian, and he really does a really good job of removing pretty much like any of the good aspects of libertarianism from his position. Like, you would think if he was libertarian, he would actually take some time on his show to be like, why don't we decriminalize drugs? Instead, he'll basically make drug users seem like they're the scourge of the earth and show collages of Seattle of junkies, nodding out on the streets with, like scary music behind it, and make it seem like this is the liberals' fault, and it's like, I just do not buy really even his presentation of himself as a libertarian. It just doesn't add up. And I mean, yeah, he does push a lot of white supremacist style rhetoric. And it's kind of curious to me because some of these same think tanks that I mentioned to you earlier have also pushed rhetoric that I would say nowadays would be considered white supremacist. I mean, like one of the most, I just randomly had a debate with this guy, this like MAGA guy a couple days ago who wanted to have a whole debate with me based on Thomas Sowell's slavery book. And I didn't even realize like Thomas Sowell was part of like the Hoover Institution. And that book, I guess, has had this enormous influence over the right to make them feel like, well, because other, populations have subjugated slaves throughout world history, our slavery really wasn't all that bad. And, it's written by a guy who happens to be black. So a lot of conservatives lean on this book as almost like their Bible for not feeling bad about slavery. So, I don't know if Tucker Carlson is like really ideologically like motivated as a white supremacist himself. I almost see it more of like his program is an outlet for some of the same like think tank rhetoric we've been seeing for a very long time, but it's just some of it's under the guise of being more populist or America first or nationalist or whatever you want to call it. And it does sort of creep closer and closer to being like, like you're saying, like this sort of almost like kind of neo-Nazi adjacent belief system. I mean, I don't know if Tucker has used terms like anti-white on his program or white genocide, but it honestly wouldn't even surprise me if he has. And, but I do think some of those like classic, think tanks have also been stoking those forces. And I don't know why they're doing it. I mean, with the, most recently with this whole groomer thing where it's like now gay people are again being seen as this like scary way to indoctrinate society. I mean, there's a lot of strange things happening in regards to that, but yeah, I mean, it's undeniable that he pushes that kind of rhetoric. And it's another thing that these people who praise him for, I think it ultimately just says more about them, especially if like they're on the left and they could tolerate all that stuff and look past it all. I mean, what does that really say about those people? It's like, aren't you a little bit concerned that he's putting out this much like white supremacist rhetoric also? I mean, so you kind of have like two things, the white supremacist rhetoric plus all the other, like neocon war rhetoric is pushing out about other countries that just don't happen to be Russia. And I just don't get it. I mean, I'm just baffled by the sort of like praise of him, from really anyone who's anti-war.
Yeah, again, I mean, I just want to stress this point that some Republicans see Russia as a white Christian country that should be allied with against China. That's why they oppose the war in Ukraine, but they're not anti-war. And the refusal to see that by some people is just really nonsense. I mean, but it's been a long time, almost 2 hours. But before we wrap up, just really briefly, I think justifiably, we spent most of the time talking about Tucker because Tucker Carlson has the most popular show in the United States on TV. He had the ear of Donald Trump. He was allegedly being considered to be Donald Trump's vice president. So, I mean, like, Tucker is a very influential figure. And in the so-called populist right, he's probably the most influential figure. But I want to briefly just address a few other figures. You, Robbie, and your sister, Abby Martin, did a great 2-part episode about Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is also being portrayed as a so-called populist, even libertarian, even though he's also full-on neocon, who loves apartheid Israel, who has been going hardcore against the BDS movement in support of Palestinian rights, boycott, divestment, sanctions. The only actions he's ever taken against big corporations, aside from this like insane anti-gay stuff with Disney, is that he took action against corporations like Ben and Jerry over their pledge to support Palestine. So supporting apartheid Israel is what he was doing, not actually fighting corporate power. And then there's also J.D. Vance, who is now running for Senate in Ohio, won the Republican primary. J.D. Vance also is portrayed as a so-called populist. He talks about the working class, but he once again wants to convince American workers that their real enemy are not capitalists, but China. So, I mean, what unites all of them is very similar talking points. But I guess just to wrap up here, maybe you can speak briefly about other so-called right-wing populists, maybe even Sagar and Jeti as well from Rising, who does the same sleight of hand, claiming to be a populist and then just doing insane anti-China propaganda. I mean, who else are we talking about here?
Well, he's a particularly interesting example, I think, Sagar and Jeti, because his podcast called The Realignment was co-hosted by a guy, I want to say his name is Marshall Isikoff, but I always get his name wrong, who used to actually work for an Israeli lobbying firm and was caught on camera in that Al Jazeera documentary admitting what he did, which was basically lie on behalf of Israel. So this is Sagar's host, sponsored by, the podcast was put on by the Hudson Institute. It was called The Realignment. You look at the guest list of it, it is a perfect mixture of the so-called right populists and straight up classic neocons, some of them even of the Trotskyite variety. I think even like Douglas Feith was on the show, and then they had on Eric Weinstein on the next episode, and then they had on someone like I want to say like Michael Malice or something like that. So the Hudson Institute seems, in my opinion, was really ahead of the curve in sort of carving out a space within alternative media. Somehow Sagar is already like accepted in the alternative media space with this podcast, and then all of a sudden he has a show that is launched by The Hill, and The Hill is owned by like a huge Trump guy. His name escapes me now, but originally the show Rising was not hosted by Crystal Ball, or no, sorry, it was hosted by Crystal Ball, but not Sagar and Jeti. It was co-hosted by a guy named Buck Sexton, who actually was a CIA agent. He did CIA ops, and he also was quoted once as saying that everything he learned in the CIA perfectly translates to his now job in media. He's basically doing the same work. So you have basically this show called The Realignment that was put on by Hudson, the show called Rising that was put on by The Hill, and they sort of merged together. When I say merged together, I mean the original version of Rising, if you watch clips of Crystal Ball and Buck Sexton, it's just like a kind of a clickbaity, topical, headline show. Nothing really unique about it at all. Very generic, pretty, forgettable. But all of a sudden, when Sagar comes on as Crystal's co-host, the show essentially morphs into and becomes a video version of the Realignment podcast from the Hudson Institute. And so I found it really interesting that Sagar was constantly popping up in these circles and left circles. I would see him on left podcasts appearing side by side with Crystal Ball. And, I slowly would see him putting out very similar rhetoric to Tucker, acting like he's anti-war on certain issues, very hawkish on China, very frequently. So when I looked into his background, what I found was kind of shocking. And I'm just surprised that I'm the only one to bother doing this, maybe because he's seen as someone who's saying the right things about Ukraine that people like to hear. So it's not worth looking deeper into his background. But what you find is he actually worked for one of the most infamous neocon think tanks in DC called the Institute for the Study of War under Kim Kagan. Not only did he work for this neocon think tank before Hudson, he also went to take counterterrorism training after his general education in college at Georgetown University in Israel at a university called IDC Herzliya that had a special counterterrorism program that was taught by a Mossad chief. And this is what he did right out of college. And this college occupies a former IDF military base. So I just find it awfully strange that we're supposed to buy this premise that somehow Sagur is a right-wing populist now. And that was his origin story, with really no explanation of when he decided that he was not a neocon anymore, or he's sort of repudiated these things. And this is something you see time and time again. It's like you find these odd things that are very neocon in these people's background, where there's not really an explanation of how they're not a neocon anymore. Someone who's recently appeared in the news because of DeSantis is Christopher Rufo of the Manhattan Institute, for somehow being one of the luckiest, basically journalists, I don't know if we'll call them journalists, since Glenn Greenwald, getting access to an amazing trove of internal corporate and even internal Treasury Department documents, making it seem like our children and our government employees are being indoctrinated to be self-hating white people. They hate themselves, and kids are basically being groomed because they're being taught about what sexual orientation is. This guy Rufo, what's fascinating about him is it's like he's kind of got a mysterious background. It's like, oh, maybe he's just a regular guy who kind of landed in this space, but there's kind of a Jamie Kirchick-ness to his background. And when I say that, I mean kind of a suspicious aspect to his background, where he was really on the tip of the spear when it came to Uyghur coverage. He actually worked for PBS and did documentaries about the Uyghurs while he was living in Xinjiang province in China. So this guy cut his teeth doing stuff about the Uyghurs like way before he got involved in critical race theory. So it's just fascinating that any of these people you kind of find, they have these odd neocon aspects of their background. Now, maybe that's completely above board. It could be a coincidence. But oftentimes when someone has in their background, you kind of have to wonder what they were actually doing that for. And, we mentioned DeSantis. I mean, he's got a very mysterious military record himself. People say he was a JAG officer that helped make sure that CIA people waterboarding people, these suspected terrorists, were doing it according to the Geneva Conventions. So when they would rectally force feed people, I guess, good old Ronnie DeSantis was there to make sure that they were pushing the tube into their anus according to the exact specification of the Geneva Conventions. So there is a sort of a mysterious, it's like people really knew nothing about his military record until he ran for governor. And all we really learned then was like, oh, he was a great guy. We really liked him, when he was around. And it's like, I personally think his background is a little strange. And to me, when I see like a black spot or a mysterious gap in someone's military record of what they actually did, concrete examples of what they did, I have to go into some Buttigieg-esque territory. And, a lot of leftists rightfully think Buttigieg, might have had some involvement with the CIA. I mean, look at what DeSantis is doing. It's not just that he has this mysterious black spot on his record. Look at what he's done as governor. Way outside the purview of governor is passing legislation condemning China, condemning communism, saying that
he just signed a legislation that forces all students in all schools to have mandatory indoctrination against communism, including they need to be taught about how evil Fidel Castro and Nicolas Maduro are. Very libertarian, forcing kids, forcing right-wing propaganda down their throats.
This is what's so fascinating about him, is that I do think a lot of people who are more civil libertarian minded have become so narrowly focused on the fact that Ron DeSantis resisted some of these COVID policies, that a lot of other governors subscribe to around the country, and they have like tunnel vision where they're not able to see all this other very suspicious stuff that he's done. So like just the idea that he's like freedom loving, that he wants to protect free speech is something I see people saying. It's like he's literally making it illegal to work for a public institution and to criticize Israel. And I mean, that's a law that he passed. And, there's even libertarians I've gone into arguments with who are like, when did he do that? Like, I don't believe that. And it's like, here's the bill. Like all these governors like him have done this. Actually, there's multiple governors. In fact, probably all these ones who act like they're pro free speech and anti-cancel culture are the ones pushing it, so it's just this fascinating juxtaposition when you really get into the weeds of what he's pushed out there. It's all very neoconservative, and it's very much in line with like someone like a Marco Rubio. And you mentioned his relationship with Israel. I mean, he's really in tight with specifically like the Likudnik faction of Israeli government people. And oddly, he called out the IDF for the Miami condo collapse rescue, and that he made some big PR stunt over, about that. And it was just an odd kind of thing to do, but that's what he did. And and now he just announced, I mean, it's not a surprise to anyone, but he just sent out an email to his supporters saying, what would you think if I ran for president? It's like, we already knew you were going to do that, dude. I mean, I see him almost like Trump was probably in some ways a very useful vessel for this same faction of like anti-China hawks that we've been talking about. But I think on some level, he really was too much of a wild card to be fully useful to carry out this agenda cleanly. And I think someone like a DeSantis is kind of perfect to be that version of Trump without that sort of unpredictable, egoistic, wild card nature. I mean, I think DeSantis is a very loyal, he's a lapdog for some power faction. And I think that's, I'm way more afraid of him becoming president than I was of Trump, personally speaking.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, Tom Cotton, is a full-on neocon, doesn't hide it in any way, and he doesn't have that kind of so-called populist cred, unlike people like DeSantis who are portrayed as like outsiders and against the so-called establishment. They, of course, never define establishment, so it just means whatever they want it to mean. It's all this language is kept very vague. Meanwhile, DeSantis is boasting publicly about how he's the strongest supporter of Israel in all of the United States. And he tweeted, as long as I'm governor of Florida, BDS will be DOA, dead on arrival. We have a moral obligation to oppose Airbnb's policy against Israel in the West Bank. And he's in his government statements, he's also referred to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria. I mean, just a full-on neocon. And, I wanted to point out on Sagar and Jetty from The Hill, I mean, it's so clear to me what the goal of that show was. I mean, The Hill is owned by this big Trump supporter and Trump donor. It's so clear that the attempt of that show is to try to deceive progressives and anti-war people because they see Crystal Ball sitting next to this neocon. They're like, oh, well, this is like a unity between so-called left-wing populism and so-called right-wing populism. Again, populism is not defined in any way, so it's just like against the establishment. And what it actually is doing is it's trying to brainwash these anti-war progressives into insane anti-China bullshit. And so look at some of the stuff, not just Sagar. I mean, Crystal Ball has played into this stuff and needs to be called out for insane neoconservative propaganda against China. Here's The Hill with Sagar and Jetty. CCP member caught revealing how China will use Wall Street to control Joe Biden. So Joe Biden is a China puppet. And again, they frame it in terms of opposition to Wall Street to pretend like they're populist, but actually what they're doing is calling for war on China. Here's Sagar and Jetty. John Cena's disgusting bow to China reveals how sold out U.S. elite is. Sagar and Jetty. Biden and West must stand up against China effort to cover up slave labor. NBA China problems show how corporations have sold out America to China. I mean, just insane neocon anti-China propaganda. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's just so disingenuous on its face that any of these people care about Uyghurs. I mean, so it's like that, it's phony that they're like just constantly bringing up the Uyghurs. And I have to wonder, when the Foundation for Defense of Democracies being paid money by the Israeli government, basically gunning for Iran this whole time, just pivots to China. I do have to wonder on some level, I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is happening, but I do believe the United States and Israel is benefiting immensely from the world outrage about mistreatment of Muslims, focusing on this idea of Uyghurs. And I do see more and more increasingly so this pulling attention away from like anything about Palestinians. And you notice that on, for example, like Rising, that's a topic that just hardly ever discussed. It's always about Uyghurs. They never discuss the Palestinian struggle whatsoever. But you did bring up something really interesting about this idea of the ruling class. That's, to me, is when things get really interesting, because when you really break down what that means to the different people watching that show. So I would assume most people who are on the left watching that show, who hear the phrase ruling class, they don't see it in a partisan way. They see it as the ruling class. It's a class of oligarchs and people who are rich and powerful, who do not break down along partisan lines. Their ideology is largely greed and power. So, but the people who are on the right, who hear the term ruling class, and I think this applies to the Tucker Carlson program as well, they imagine in their mind as the liberals, the liberal elites, the coastal elites only. They're not thinking about this mass of, the actual ruling class that comprises of people who have left and right-wing ideology. So I think that that's a really important distinction. And this idea that China controls Wall Street is also something very fundamental to, I think, this realignment is what their original podcast was titled. Well, I think it's a forced and artificial realignment to try to trick people on the left into buying into this idea that America has, again, lost its agency, that we're cucked. Wall Street is now controlled by China, and all our politicians are bought by China. And I think that is something you see also pushed by some leftists, strangely enough, like, or so-called leftists like Matt Stoller. And there's other people like him who sort of
psycho at this point. I mean, Matt Stoller compares China to Nazi Germany. I mean, just like completely batshit. And the fact that he is also welcomed in this is really reflective of this problem, that it's worked, that this cynical campaign I was talking about has worked, of trying to convince people on the left that like these right-wing populists are anti-war. And now people who claim to be on the left are buying into this insane anti-China shit.
Yeah. And I mean, I even saw, you posted, you're showing one of Sagar's, like this Chinese scholar is admitting how China will control Wall Street and insidiously take over the United States. I mean, that is something like what a Rachel Maddow would play on her program. Like, look at this Russian media official from RT saying how they have a campaign to divide the American public. It's like, to me, it's just as ludicrous as playing a clip of that and saying that this is the truth. Like, this is what's happening. Russia is, launching this massive disinformation campaign on us, and they've gotten us divided at each other's throats. Well, Glenn Greenwald posted that same video of that same like Chinese academic guy and said, like, look how alarming this is. Like, they're just giving up the plot here. And it's like, and you look at all the comments and everyone's saying like, Glenn, you're doing like, this is like kind of Russiagate-y, like what you're doing. Like, what do you mean? And it's just the lack of self-awareness is strange. And I don't understand why there aren't more people being like, yeah, we shouldn't be bending. We shouldn't just be like falling all over ourselves. This paranoid about China or Russia seems to not serve us in our problems here at this time, especially. Like, we have a shitload of problems happening here. Like, maybe we shouldn't attribute everything bad happening here to two different foreign countries that happen to be our main adversaries in the geopolitical scheme of things. I mean, come on, guys.
Yeah, and just wrapping up here, I just wanted to show two other videos here on the Hill, and again, just showing this insane propaganda from Sagar. And Crystal and Sagar debate Chinese virus nomenclature, and of course, Sagar defends calling it the COVID the Chinese virus. And Crystal and Sagar, Chinese government moves to kill democracy in Hong Kong. Crystal and Sagar, bubonic plague discovered in China. I mean, this shit is just like ridiculous, insane clickbait propaganda. And it goes back to the point we made throughout this, the beginning of this stream here, this discussion, is that when people are trying to rebrand the right as so-called populist or anti-war, what they're actually saying is that they are opposed to one specific war, but actually they support other wars. So, I mean, we've been referencing this stuff from these tweets from Glenn Greenwald. This is his tweet on May 12th. He said, "I'm sorry this traditionally left-wing view on war is now heard overwhelmingly instead in anti-interventionist GOP camps and on Fox News, almost never in mainstream liberal outlets or from Democratic politicians, all of whom voted for Biden's $40 billion escalation. But it's a fact." So I responded pointing out that that's not true at all. Yeah, of course, most Democrats are pro-war, and I constantly nonstop criticize the Democrats. But the idea of the GOP and Fox being anti-interventionist is complete nonsense. Both of them are pro-war. They just disagree on the targets of empire. Democrats want war on Russia. Republicans want war on China, Iran, and Cuba, and they're all imperialists. And then Glenn responded, just angry as hell. He said, "That's utter fucking bullshit." Very articulate, very substantive response, Glenn. And then he said, "You're just inventing fiction because your religion teaches virtuous political ideas can only reside on the left." So again, just immediately getting to like these ridiculous ad hominem attacks, saying that I'm dogmatic. My religion, also called reality, the idea that the right wing is not pro-war, well, that's a religion. So you make up facts to obscure the anti-war sentiment for the war right now. The war now is on the right. And then I responded pointing out the U.S. is waging many wars right now, not just on Ukraine, also on China, Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran. And of course, he didn't respond because maybe deep down, he's so delusional that he actually thinks that Republicans are now anti-war. But once again, it shows that it's all moving the goalposts, that all you have to have is one Republican on TV mildly criticize one war while pushing for a new war. And suddenly the narrative is that Republicans are the new anti-war voice. Meanwhile, the actual anti-war movement, the actual anti-war organizations organizing anti-war protests, like the Answer Coalition or Code Pink, they're leftists, they're socialists, they're anti-imperialists, and they recognize that both parties are pro-war. So that's just the note I wanted to end on, is that we've seen people basically trying to convince us of lesser evilism, but for fucking Republicans.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, and I think that's very deliberate. I mean, that's why I think that a lot of the Republicans themselves are embracing sort of boilerplate, substance-free anti-war rhetoric. And, I think in that, Thomas Massey, I think is one of the only Republicans, like I was saying originally, that actually voted against like some stuff to like call out the Uyghur plight. He's actually been one of the only ones that hasn't, as far as I know, and I could be completely wrong about this, I haven't seen anything where he's been playing into the escalation against China. Literally the only one. I mean, like everybody else who's adopting this boilerplate rhetoric, Josh Hawley, Marjorie Taylor Greene, you look at their tweets about it, and sometimes they'll even say it in the same tweet. They'll be like, we can't be sending $40 billion to Ukraine. We need to like be, stopping the CCP influence. Sometimes they'll do it in different tweets, but it's just very clear that their script is mixed together with a pro-war script on China or on whatever, like if it came to, let's say if Cuba became sort of a hot button topic again, they would all pivot to being pro-regime change there. And that shouldn't surprise anyone. All the talking points are already there. But yeah, it is just bizarre that Glenn Greenwald typically does actually prop up some of these, right populist politicians who do put out a lot of anti-China rhetoric, like Hawley or like Blake Masters or J.D. Vance, and he doesn't really lift up people who are consistently anti-war. And that's, and again, I think that that's part of the fundamental issue here. It's like, let's maybe only lift up people for being anti-war who are consistently anti-war, just as a starting point. Doesn't matter if you're right or left wing. If anti-war is your thing, like, then look at it from that perspective. Like criticize people when they're being pro-war on certain issues, even if you think they're good on other wars. I mean, so that's the thing I guess I'll leave people with is there's no sacred cows. A lot of people, even Chomsky has been wrong on different wars over the years. So like nobody's should be completely immune to criticism just because they've done good work. And I think that, it's really too easy these days to just virtue signal being anti-war without actually backing it up with anything.
Yeah, well said, Robbie. Well, I kept you longer than I originally had planned, but I think it was a really good discussion. I'm glad we could, in one place, just cover all of this and show all the clips and provide all that context, because this is just something that I've seen get worse and worse. And I kind of thought that it was just like a minor thing that people would move on, like pretending like these right-wing fanatics are supposedly anti-war. But it's incredible to see that a significant part of the Republican Party has jumped on this as a narrative that they're using to try to get elected. They're using to try to, take political power. And then, of course, when they take power, we saw what happened with Trump. Trump, again, tore up arms control agreements with Russia, started a trade war with China, expanded brutal sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba, expanded the war in Yemen, expanded the war in Afghanistan, refused to withdraw the U.S. troops from Syria and said that he was going to keep U.S. troops in Syria because he wanted to keep the oil. I mean, killed Iran's second in command, Qasem Soleimani. I mean, the attempt to portray him as anti-war is fucking insane. And now we've seen other Republicans use the same strategies. So before they're successful again, I think it's really important to call out just this farce. It's a completely cynical scam. So I'm glad, I could be joined by you, Robbie. You've done so much good research on this, and anyone watching or listening should go check out his Twitter account, Fluorescent Gray, and also especially his really good documentary series, A Very Heavy Agenda, which is about, all of these neoconservative forces that we were talking about today. And of course, his excellent radio show with his sister, Robbie Martin, Media Roots Radio. Robbie, is there anything else that people should follow that you do?
No, I mean, that's pretty much it. Media Roots Radio is where I usually put like all, the brain dump for all this research primarily. So, if you want to learn more about like the Committee on the Present Danger China or the Hudson Institute or DeSantis and his sort of neocon connections, we've done several podcasts about a lot of the things we've talked about on today's episode. So I recommend going to check those out.
Great.
And thanks for having me, Ben.
Of course, Robbie. We were talking with Robbie Martin, a great journalist. Definitely check out his work. And I want to thank everyone who joined. It was a great discussion. It was much longer than I thought it would be, but I think we covered so much good territory. It's important to get that on the record. So thanks for watching and listening. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/multipolarista. For everyone watching on YouTube, definitely please click the red subscribe button. I'm trying to build up this new channel. And this, as always, after the stream is over, this podcast will be, this audio will be available as a podcast as well if you want to listen. So definitely keep in touch, everyone. And I'll definitely have Robbie back in the future to talk about what the neocons are up to. And I'll see you all next time. Thanks.